well, I suppose it's my life's work, which is documented in my memoir. And I hope you find it interesting and maybe even quite entertaining. Right, now the fact that geologists can lead such interesting and at times dangerous lives may surprise you. There is, I know, a popular image of bearded men with rocks in their heads and their noses in outcrops waxing lyrical over this rock or that mineral or a fossil. And I suppose there is some of that, but the reality for most geologists, and certainly for me, is really quite different. Sir Douglas Mawson was the prime Australian example, and although my own experience has been a little less dramatic than surviving in the Antarctic wilderness, they do nevertheless comprise a heady mix of intensive exposure to the elements, an eclectic cast of characters, and a unique perspective on the natural world. Professor Ross Large, AO, who wrote my preface, described my adventures as, quote, the stuff of Indiana Jones. And therein, I believe, lies the appeal of my book to a broad audience. If we are lucky, we humans get to experience personally just 0.0000016% of Earth history. If we extend that to what we have, quote, on record, it's really not very much more. And that number is not much of a sample on which to draw conclusions about the impact and significance of the dynamic Earth processes taking place around us today. We happily study human history to avoid being doomed to repeat it. And yet Earth history is a blank canvas for many people. And I think that's a shame, because just as human history is a guiding discipline that helps us understand and interpret our modern society, so Earth history is our guide to understanding and interpreting contemporary changes in the natural world. In 1961, when my mother told her lifelong friend Esma that I was at university studying geology, Esma replied, "Oh, you mean he's going into the church?" Esma's confusion of geology with theology knocked my youthful ego back a peg or two, probably quite deservedly. It's amusing in retrospect, but it's perhaps understandable for a woman born over 100 years ago who had only very limited education as she grew up during the Great Depression. In the early 1960s, geology as a science was virtually unknown outside academic circles. Professional geologists were rare specimens indeed. Surely no one today would make Esma's mistake. And perhaps not, but to my mind, one of the great failings of modern society is its ignorance of the Earth we live on. There are many people these days who would, quote, save the planet, but few of them understand just how that planet actually works. Nor do they appreciate the length and resilience of its vast history and why, therefore, it does not really need us to save it. Those people who glue themselves to the road claiming the end of the world is nigh would be well advised to study a little bit of Earth history. If they did so, they would discover that our world is always either warming or cooling, and both geological history and human history show that warming is a lot better for life on Earth than cooling. They would also discover that over 95% of all the species that have ever lived on Earth were extinct long before Greta Thunberg was born. But that's another story. Part of the problem is that most people's view of the world is limited to two dimensions, the ground they walk around on every day. And this is a pity, because the truth is, even three dimensions are not enough to understand our planet. It's only when we read the stories of creation that are written in the rocks beneath our feet, that our place on Earth can be seen in context. Most people look at a rock and see, well, a rock. As a geologist, I look at a rock and see a story. The first time I stood at Bright Angel Point on the rim of the Grand Canyon was a light bulb experience for me. It was only then I truly understood that our planet really has depth as well as length, breadth, and height. Not only so, but as I gazed down at nearly 2 kilometers of stacked geological history, it dawned on me why Albert Einstein insisted on 4 dimensions to describe our universe. Layer upon layer upon layer of sandstone, shale, and limestone represented not just repeated deposition of sediments, but also the accumulated strata physically demonstrated Einstein's 4th dimension, time, deep geological time. Now, geologists study rocks not because of a perverse obsession with inanimate objects, but because rocks are a direct link with times past. The Grand Canyon is like the Great Library of Alexandria. The rock layers we see there are the papyruses on which the history of planet Earth was written eons ago. Stories written in stone show that stability is rare for our planet, with constant change the norm. Transformations happen at a pace we barely notice during our fleeting lifetimes, but the evidence is there for us all to see if we care to look. When I ventured into earth science at Sydney University in 1961, at the tender age of 16, it was the beginning of a lifelong fascination with our planet. Over more than 50 years, my zeal for the Earth has taken me to countless exotic and remote places, both in Australia and overseas. Many were the times I said to myself, I can't believe I'm being paid to do this. Mind you, there were also plenty of times when I said to myself, they're not paying me enough to do this. But in those places, I met a lot of people, some wonderful, some bizarre, some eminently forgettable, but many who have influenced my life very much for the better. I've had numerous adventures and surprising encounters, some a bit hazardous and frightening, others joyful and rewarding. And together, these people and the experiences I shared with them have shaped me as a person and formed an awareness of environment that makes me extremely grateful that geology became my life's work. I have read the stones and listened to their voices murmuring in the desert, in the rainforest, in the mountains, and on the plains. It was the stones that told me how the world was made. It was the stones that explained why the landscape looks like it does. And it was the stones that showed me where the Earth's treasures are hidden. My reading of the rocks has revealed the unhurried pace of the Earth and the immense history that those stones, those rocky outcrops, those pebbles beneath the gurgling waters hold in their embrace. As I approached the end of high school in 1960, I knew that I should be looking to science for a career, but was struggling to know where within the scientific spectrum I might find a place. Almost by accident, I came upon geology, which seemed to offer a means of supporting myself that combined science, the great outdoors, and expenses paid travel to faraway places. At that stage, I had never met a geologist, and I didn't have much of an understanding of what geologists actually did. But never mind, the more I considered it, the more my curiosity grew. I wanted to not just to see the sights of the outback and foreign lands, but to understand them, to know how they got to be as they are. I wanted to comprehend and experience at first hand the fundamental forces of nature and the history of our planet. From the beginning, I wanted to know what stuff the Earth is made of. So did the Greeks and other ancient societies. As early as 450 BC, Greek philosophers had formulated a hypothesis that would hold sway for over 2,000 years. They deduced that the material form of the world was made up by combinations of 4 essential substances that they called elements. These 4 elements were identified as earth, air, fire, and water. Later, Aristotle added a 5th element that he called the ether, which he thought bound the other 4 together. The principle of there being these fundamental, indivisible components of matter inhabited all science and philosophy for the next 2 millennia. It was not until modern physics and chemistry began to develop as rigorous sciences that the ancient Greek view of matter was finally discredited. But as I look back at my experience, those fundamental elements seem to have provided a structure or a framework that binds my experience into a meaningful whole, making my life truly a journey through the elements. So what is this book all about? Well, it's not really a book about geology, don't stress about that, although simplified earth science does illuminate the text and adds background to many of the stories told. At its most basic level, though, it is a book about our home, this big rock we live on, and how that rock interacts with the life that clings to its surface. The book offers a combination of humour, history, science, and personal anecdotes to bring to life a dynamic and inspiring world that most people cherish, but I suspect few have encountered quite so vividly. There are 38 chapters grouped into 5 parts. The first of these is subtitled Fiat Lux, and this deals with my time at the University of California at Berkeley in the 1960s, where I studied for my PhD in geology. From the High Sierra of California to Arizona's Grand Canyon, and from the high plateaus of Utah to the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, this naive young Aussie was all agog as he discovered the sheer extravagance of Western American culture and geology. As I said, the Grand Canyon is a great place to recognize that our world really does exist in 4 dimensions. You can share that experience in this section. You can also read about the hippie movement of the 1960s and flower power in San Francisco and at Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley. You can discover what makes top American universities so successful. You can learn why California is indeed so special. You can share my ebullience as I stand at over 11,000 feet atop a mountain peak in Utah, looking down at Lowder Creek. I kid you not. And you can suffer with my wife, Margaret, and me as we literally almost freeze to death in the snowy High Sierra of California. The second part is really the core of the book. It consists of an in-depth exposure to a remote part of Papua New Guinea, the Willamaz Peninsula on the north coast of New Britain. It was there in 1967 that I went with my bride of 5 days, now almost 55 years, to conduct field work on a chain of young volcanoes that became the essence of my PhD dissertation. We were a very naive young couple when we arrived in Talicia, the main settlement on the peninsula. I had just turned 23 and Margaret was only 21. We spent the next 3 months living and working with the native Melanesian people of the Talicia district and with the small expatriate community that governed them in those pre-independence colonial days. This part of the book draws heavily on a diary that Margaret kept while we were in PNG, and I thank her sincerely for allowing me to use that as a resource. A good part of our time in PNG was spent living in huts called house kiaps in native villages, far from any other expatriates, where we were forced by circumstances to learn Pidgin English very rapidly. Pidgin, or Tok Pisin, is the lingua franca of New Britain and northern New Guinea. We arrived there thinking Pidgin was just baby talk English. We soon learned otherwise. The village children who followed me around at times as I broke rock outcrops with my geological hammer gave me the epithet I have used as a subtitle for this part of the book, Master Belang Burukim Stone, or Mr. Who Breaks Rocks. Overall, our time in PNG was an intensely immersive experience that simply could not be repeated today. We quickly grew fond of the village people, some of whom acted as carriers and guides, and we learned to rely on them in a way that shocked the resident expatriates. They're a useless bunch, we were told by a plantation manager in Talisia. Not so in our experience. Well, some were a bit thick, but others, like Garry and Utu from Bulumuri village, became friends and even mentors as they paddled us over coral reefs in their outrigger canoes, welcomed us to their village sing-sings, sat with us around a campfire, led us up and down their volcanic mountains, and guided us through their rainforest home. Look out, Master, Mongbongi stop. Look out, Mr. Stinging Plant here. As you read this section, I hope my stories and the people you will meet in them will reveal a side to this beautiful, but today much troubled country that will surprise and delight you. Then come several chapters grouped under the subtitle of Equatorial Emeralds. These tell of my adventures in Sulawesi, Indonesia. There we Aussie geologists were immersed deeply in provincial Indonesia, far from the bars and beaches of Bali or the massed humanity of Jakarta. There too, my fascination with the exuberant life force of the tropical rainforest was given full license, even as it was tempered by the physical and human challenges of working in such a demanding and at times dangerous environment. As we toiled in the lush but rugged and often almost impossibly steep terrain, we were exposed daily to everything from leeches and vicious thorns of rotan vines to 5-meter pythons and tribes of aggressive macaque monkeys. However, I did find time to appreciate the verdant growth and the immense variety of the forest around me. On occasion, I was even able to collect wild orchids and bring them back to Sydney for the botanists at the Botanic Gardens. But as a place to work, I can tell you that the tropical rainforest can test the resolve of even the hardiest of geologists. Indeed, nothing spoils the relief of finally taking your boots off at the end of a tough day in the jungle as seeing your socks dripping with your own blood thanks to leeches between your toes. But that and experiences like jumping out of hovering helicopters and being adrift at sea in the middle of the night in a dugout canoe with a broken down outboard motor and an offshore wind, for me, all in a day's work. Then come stories in which I expose what it means to be a passionate prospector. The settings range from mountains in Papua New Guinea, where I was commissioned to sell a gold mine, to saunas in Finland, where I was regaled with the history of this fascinating and alluring land while sweating it out at 90 degrees C. And you are taken from deep underground in Kalgoorlie's fabulous Golden Mile to the halls of bureaucracy as I relate my own Yes Minister experience. Here too, the frequently asked question of how do you know where to look is answered by a real-life example as I explain how to find a gold mine. Finally, attention is turned to my continuing passions, the things that continue to interest and motivate me. These range from the arid Australian outback to tropical rainforests, and from the fiery hot deserts of Mount Isa to mountains of fire in Russia and Hawaii, where I take you up close and personal to some active volcanoes. Here too, I recount the story of Paul Wilson, an outstanding geologist and one of the finest people I ever worked with, who later became the victim of a terrible tragedy. As you read, you will, I hope, see how a deep infatuation with planet Earth, the appreciation of country, as I believe it is understood by Australia's Indigenous people, and an enduring appreciation of my fellow man have come together to give me a fulfilling life and make me into the person I am today. I conclude the book with a brief look at the future and what might lie in store for us and our descendants as the dynamic forces of planet Earth continue their relentless momentum. Throughout it all, the elements, earth, air, fire, and water, appear as a recurrent theme, linking the narrative parts and charting my journey through danger, isolation, awe, and excitement, as I seek to inform and entertain those whose lives may have been a bit more conventional. Now, I'm going to read you a few little sections from the book to give you a taste of what it's about. And while that's happening, we're going to run a slideshow up on the screen of pictures that are in the book. Thanks, Jim. That'll just run in the background as I read. Now, the first little bit I want to bring to you is from our time in California when Margaret and I lived there while I was studying. And this little episode relates to the time we went up into the high Sierra Nevada in winter to collect some samples for my professor, and we got caught in a snowstorm. So here we go. I continue with my sampling while Margaret wandered around looking for evidence of a prehistoric workshop. Each sample was given a number and a description of its field setting was recorded in my yellow covered field notebook. Anxious to impress my prof, I focused intently on the task at hand, not noticing the gathering gloom. Finally, I was done, and after putting the last of a dozen or so specimens into my backpack, I stood up and arched my back into a good stretch. As I did so, my eyes were drawn to the overcast sky, which I could now see was much darker and more threatening than it had been when we left the vehicle a few hours earlier. I was still confident, but my initial bravado was now tempered by a pang of doubt, which only increased as I felt the cold sting of the first snowflakes on my face. Shit, it's beginning to snow. We better get out of here, I declared. We quickly gathered up our things and set off through the sagebrush back toward the car, moving rather more rapidly than we had on the outward journey, notwithstanding the load of rocks in my backpack. There was little conversation as we retreated, with both of us feeling increasingly apprehensive. It was remarkable and quite frightening how quickly the bleached grey landscape was turning white. I don't think I have enough clothes on, said Margaret. We'll be right, just walk faster, I replied, trying to exude confidence, which was visibly betrayed by my uncontrolled shivering. Was it cold or fear? Snow was beginning to accumulate on the road, and I was pleased we had left the vehicle facing back to where we needed to go. I should explain we're on a closed road without approval. Piling our gear, including the precious rock samples, into the back of the Ford, we jumped in the front and I turned on the ignition. The starter motor growled and growled and growled, but the engine did not start. I tried again to no avail. Fearful of flattening the battery, I suggested we better try a rolling start, not knowing then that this is impossible with an automatic transmission. The Ford rolled down the gentle slope and came to a silent stop. No hint of an engine start. Laboriously, we tried pushing the car back up the hill to try again, but it was futile. Bloody hell, now what do we do? We're going to have to walk out to the main road to get help, of course, Margaret replied tersely, venting the rising tension between us. It'll be a bit of a challenge to walk 4 miles in these conditions, I declared, stating the bleeding obvious. But we're on a closed road, no one knows we're here, and no one will come to our rescue if we stay. I guess we don't have any choice. The snow was falling heavier than ever. The temperature seemed to be dropping even more, and now the wind had come up. We were in a blizzard and in more danger than we either realized or wanted to admit. Well, come on then, we better get going. I tried to sound reassuring to Margaret, while inwardly feeling foolish to have put us in this predicament. Suddenly, I felt very cold and quite scared. It is remarkable how far a simple 4 miles can be when the circumstances are dire. After an hour or so, with little idea of how far we had come, we took a breather. Our clothes had become icy carapaces. Icicles hung from our eyebrows as we squinted against the glare. My 3-day-old beard was caked in ice, and our hair had become crisp white helmets. But though we were tiring, we resumed the trek rather than rest longer and succumb to the cold. Encouraging each other vocally to hide our concern, we even laughed at the contrast between Mono Lake and the steamy jungles of Talisea in Papua New Guinea, which we had so recently left behind. Wouldn't the Talisea crowd be amazed to see us now, I asked. They'd think we're crazy. Garry, they thought we were crazy the whole time we were in Talisea. That shut me up as another hour passed. But we did survive that. We'll skip over to something else. I want to read you a little extract from the time that Margaret and me were in PNG, and we were staying in a house kiap in the village of Bulamuri at the northern end of the peninsula. We were there by ourselves with no other expatriates, just us and the local people. It became our pattern, while in Bulamuri, that Margaret accompanied me into the bush about every second day and remained in the village on the intervening days. The days at home were spent reading and chatting to the women of the village. As her pidgin improved and the conversations grew longer and more complex, one of the first things the women wanted to know was, "You got Piccadilly, missus? Do you have children, missus?" "Oh, God, no." "How much time you been, missus?" "How long have you been a missus?" "One Punamon, 1 month." By Margaret's account, the uproarious laughter that followed this answer ran in audible relay from the women on the beach up to those in the village nearby and along to the farthest house. Just why the revelation of our newlywed status caused such amusement to the village women was unclear, but it was not such a bad thing. The village people soon became even more friendly and solicitous of our welfare. My study of the geology of this area required me to examine and sample rock outcrops wherever I could. In the rainforest, this was commonly difficult, as such rocks as did crop out were generally hidden by undergrowth or covered in moss, and their volcanic features were obscured. Other than inside the caldera, the best outcrops were along the coast, where lava flows and ash deposits emerged from under the trees and formed little cliffs and buttresses at the shoreline. With Utu's canoe up on the lake, Garry offered us the use of his canoe, which was similar to Utu's, but newer and in better condition. It did not leak for a start. One memorable day, we set off in Garry's canoe to travel around the coast to the northwest. After paddling a short distance, Garry put up a crude sail. Quickly, the canoe began powering over the reef before a stiff breeze, heavy with tropical salt. It was pure exhilaration. Ahead of us, the water was brilliantly clear, allowing the sunlight to penetrate deeply, where it seemed to be broken into its components by the reef and reflect back onto our faces with a multicolored animated sparkle. The gentle swish of the seawater against the canoe as we sailed along was a warm, soothing sound, making us feel as much at ease in this place as Garry and Utu obviously were. Brightly coloured fish could be seen darting amongst the coral reef as we peered into the water around us. It was pure bliss. Relaxed as we were, it came as a shock when Utu suddenly jumped off the canoe and disappeared underwater. Seconds later, he emerged holding a turtle about 1/2 metre across and tossed it into the canoe. "Taro ser good pela kai kai." "Turtle is good eating," announced Garry, as Utu, looking very pleased with himself, clambered back into the canoe. He and Garry chatted away for several minutes, presumably working out how they would share the Chelonian spoils. At regular intervals, we pulled into the shore so I could examine the rocks and take some samples. And while I did that, Margaret sat on the coral sand under the overhanging trees, seeking relief from the intensity of the tropical sun. "I bet there are plenty of people who would pay a lot of money for this experience," she observed, as handfuls of white coral sand trickled through her fingers. "Yeah, I guess you're right. Why don't you stay here for a bit while I go on further with Garry and Utu, I suggested. This beach is the nicest one we've seen, and you should be fine here in the shade. Is that okay with you? Of course. Leaving Margaret with some water, a book, and my .22 rifle, we three men continued our journey around the coast. It was a good thing that she had opted to wait there, as before long the reef became impassable by canoe, and we had to beach it and walk along the coast, climbing over sharp black outcrops of lava that had flowed out to the sea. Some 3 hours later, we returned, tired and sweaty, to Margaret's beach. Utu asked if he could borrow the rifle to go hunting, and I agreed, as I had come to trust this nuggety bundle of energy. Utu said he would walk back to the village with his catch. Garry, meanwhile, was happy to sit on his canoe and have a smoke. I've never seen colours like these, Margaret declared, looking out over the crenulated, sparkling water. It all looks so inviting. Well, then let's go for a swim, I suggested. The lure of the pastel blue rippling water, which contrasted with the mottled browns and dappled yellows of the submerged reef, could no longer be resisted. So Margaret and I moved along the beach a discreet distance from Garry. There we had a swim that I found gloriously refreshing after so much exertion. As we part sailed and part paddled back to Bulamuri, with me up front because Utu had gone hunting, I trailed a fishing line out the back of the canoe and was delighted to catch our dinner. It looks a bit like a rock cod, I suggested as I threw the flapping creature into the canoe and asked Garry if it was good to eat. Yes, master. Good fella kai true. Later, a fully satisfied master announced to the Mrs. Cook, Garry was right, that fish really was delicious. Well after dark, Utu returned to the village, proudly displaying a pig and a big lizard he had shot with my gun. There are many more experiences which we shared that you could read about if you'd like. But one I want to share with you now was when I, with two of my local companions, climbed the highest mountain on the peninsula, Mount Wangori, which was about 1,300 meters above sea level. Dusk is very brief in low latitudes such as these, and as we sat there, I could almost hear the sizzle as the sun sank quickly into the Bismarck Sea. For just a few minutes, the western clouds shone brightly, layered in reds and yellows. The evening rays bathed all three of us in a warm glow that seemed to pick out and highlight the smooth structure of Gabriel's young face and the lines of experience etched into Utu's older visage. Their brown skin became radiantly golden in the fading sunlight, and I thought of these people as a handsome race, well adapted to their environment. I knew I had the respect of these two Melanesian men, such was their colonial upbringing, but after dinner, as we sat around the fire on the beach, the barriers of race and class and social status dissolved into the darkness. We were just three mates swapping yarns around a campfire. As I listened to them, I felt privileged to share a level of trust they might never have given to their more traditional masters. With their bright eyes shining in the firelight, they related tale after tale, immersing me ever deeper into Melanesian culture. Stories of spirits and ancestors, of the land, the sea, and the sky, of birds and trees, of fiery mountains, and how things came to be the way they are. Their endeavour to understand the world around them mirrored my own fascination with Earth history. Even now, as I recall the experience, a little shiver of pleasure tingles the back of my scalp. The next morning, it was back to reality. After a quick breakfast, we set off around 6:30 a.m. to scale Mount Wangori, which sat looming over us like a brooding beast of prey. Gabriel carried a day pack with food and water, and I carried my geological hammer and the shotgun, as I had promised. I should explain that Mount Wangori, by local legend, was inhabited by a mysterious snake spirit called the Masalai. There was no track to follow, so Utu, spared the need to carry my large sledgehammer, took the lead, slashing a path through the undergrowth with his machete. The going was tough, and as we made our way higher, it became increasingly steep. But by then I was very fit and found the physical challenge well within my capacity. The two dogs from Gabriel's village accompanied us, yapping and panting around us as we made our ascent. By 11 a.m, I stood at the summit of Mount Wangore, on a narrow ridge between the outer slope of the mountain behind me and the floor of the crater some 50 meters below in front of me. It was a different world up there, quite unlike anything I had seen previously on the Willimaeus Peninsula. The forest dripped with moisture as thick cloud drifted amongst the trees, creating weird shapes and shadows in the half-light. Moss grew long and shaggy on the tree trunks, competing with fungi, some brightly coloured, some mottled brown or dirty white. Beneath my feet, the leaf litter reeked of impermanence. The only sound was the panting of the dogs. In this eerie atmosphere, I could almost believe in spirits and demons, but much to Uta's relief, there was no sign of the Masalai. Meeting Tingi Savi Musket Belongina Parai Longam. I think he knows about the gun you have and is frightened of it, declared Utu. I saw no point in arguing with this logic as we stood shivering slightly in the chill, damp air. Well, now maybe a little extract from the Indonesian episodes. The helicopter begins its slow descent towards our destination. It is 40 minutes since we left the security of civilization in Gorontalo, rising through still air in hot sunshine and heading east towards the cloud-misted mountains that form the backbone of Sulawesi Utara, or North Sulawesi. Suspended in a tiny machine that is dwarfed by the landscape around us, I feel very exposed. As we leave the bright sunshine and continue cruising just below the cloud, I am glad that visual flight rules are mandatory up here, where clouds can have solid centres and there is no flat ground for an emergency landing. Helicopter flying is a tussle between exhilaration and fear, especially here. It seems unnatural. It is unnatural, but for us, it is also the most practical way to penetrate this wilderness. Lifting off my headphones, I listened once again to the loud, reassuring whine of the Jet Ranger's turbine engine. The dangers are many, and they are not just mechanical. As I look to the southeast and see a build-up of huge cumulonimbus thunderheads linked to Earth by a grey veil of heavy rainfall, heading this way, no doubt. Beneath and beside me, the land is draped in a smooth carpet of green, unbroken except for the occasional grey cliff or yellow landslide scar. Descending further, the carpet begins to resolve into individual trees, giving it texture, more a shag pile than a berber. Here and there, kapok trees protrude above the canopy, distinguished by their straight vertical trunks and horizontal branches, with sparse leaves and dangling seed pods. Now we have leveled out, flying parallel to the heavily wooded slopes on our left. How can such large trees stay upright on that steep ground? Now I can look into the crevices that split the verdure and see deep within them ribbons of white that mark the runoff from yesterday's rain. Our destination appears ahead and below, a helipad that is nothing more than a flat postage stamp dug by hand into a spur on the steep bank of the creek. From here it looks minuscule, treacherous, a tiny target almost lost among the grandeur of the mountains. Can we really get down there? Will this machine actually even fit on it? I guess I'll know soon enough. The pilot executes a tight banking turn over the helipad, slowing our descent almost to a hover as he faces the helicopter out towards the open sky. The constant whine of the turbine is replaced now by a fast and rhythmic whop, whop, whop as the spinning rotor tilts and cuts through the exhaust from the engine. Gently, under total control, the helicopter settles onto the helipad. Yes, we do fit, and we have arrived safely at Cabang Kiri. Marveling yet again at the skill of these ex-Vietnam American pilots, I jump out of the chopper, running with lowered head to the edge of the helipad where John shouts a greeting into my ear. We stand nearby as, without shutting down, the machine is quickly unloaded by two of the field assistants. John is calm while I am anxious to keep an eye on the spinning tail rotor. I know I shouldn't worry, these guys are experienced fieldies, but the hazard is real and it makes me nervous just to watch. The task is soon completed, and John gives the pilot a thumbs up. Without further ceremony, the helicopter lifts off, rising vertically at first, then dipping its nose and accelerating forward, fleeing to the open sky where it turns right and quickly disappears from our sight and hearing. My eyes ring in the silence that follows, and I feel an unsettling sense of abandonment. I think we have time for another one. This is in the section where I talk a lot about the Australian Outback and my love of the Outback and my experience there.
Just before you start there, would you like me to get these slides going again?
Oh, they stopped.
Yeah.
If you like.
Thanks.
We in Australia live in an ancient land whose temporal dimension is so great that its geographic transformation has slowed to an amble. Change in our land is unhurried, subtle, and immensely patient. True as much of our Indigenous people as it is of our arid landscape. Our Indigenous culture has endured for longer than any other, and it behoves us to examine why this is so. For I have observed that many of the conflicts that occur between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians seem to arise from differing perspectives of time. In the city, time is precious and we lust after it, claiming there is never enough. Patience may be a virtue, but it is one distributed very thinly across our urban society. In the desert, time is plentiful, and patience is an abundant commodity, but not one without value. It takes a commitment of time for the uniquely Australian character of our landscape, that vast expanse we call the Outback, to register in our awareness. Not all of the Outback is truly noteworthy, to be honest, for much of it is bleak, barren, and a genuine challenge to survival. But as befits our national identity, hidden within our wide panorama are pockets of serene charm that require time to notice and appreciate. We need time to hear and really see the rocks and soil, the grass and trees, the insects and animals that otherwise form just a background tapestry. Country is more than beauty and less, for it is not what we see in country that matters, but what we feel. The radiance that emanates from country comes to us not with demands for submission, but with invitations to communion. It takes time and patience to immerse ourselves deep enough into the ordinary that our senses are awakened to the extraordinary. Those jewels of the Outback that link us to our land like wormholes in outer space. You can come across them unexpectedly in settings where to the uninformed eye there is no splendor, only heat, harsh light, dust and flies. They may lack the grandeur of an alpine peak or the reflective serenity of a mountain lake, but their impact can be just as great precisely because they are so unexpected. The Mount Isa region in northwest Queensland is replete with such surprises. For much of the year, the temperature hovers in the 30s or 40s, occasionally even more. The red rocks that sporadically show splashes of green, where the copper sulfides they contain have oxidized to malachite, stand up in barriers dividing the land into domains of ridge and valley. Bold outcrops soak up the sun and radiate it back onto passers-by with a vengeance. Between the ridges, in the exposed valley floors, the hot wind whistles in short gusts, summoning spinning dust devils that dance across the bare soil patches, whipping up the dust but leaving the gibbers undisturbed before disappearing into the scrub as though embarrassed by their exuberance. The bush itself seems lifeless, leaves hanging down despondently, despairing, without hope. In reality, those leaves are just conserving moisture in the relentless solar blaze. Colour and contrast fade in the intense sunlight, and distance perception is lost. It's as though the scene is viewed with one eye closed. But then down below the ridge, secreted away in gullies that cut across the grain of the land and offer shade and sometimes even a refreshing pool, pockets of country lie waiting to be discovered. Quiet glades that provide sanctuary and total contrast from the severity of the exposed ridges and baking valleys. Well, let me wrap things up for today. And thank you for your patience. Let me summarize by saying that the heart and soul of this book is my empathy for the natural world and the people who live there, whether desert, rainforest, or in between. And when it comes to the Australian bush, nothing epitomizes it better than the traditional Australian bush ballad. Now, I am no Banjo Paterson or Henry Lawson, but I love reading and reciting some of our best bush ballads, and I've had a crack at writing some ditties of my own, 3 of which are in the book. So I'll finish today with one of those. It's called Pay Dirt. Goes like this. In a bleak and barren landscape of flies and heat and dust, old Paddy McGee, the prospector, his face a sunburned crust, in shabby hat and faded vest, his beard like scaly rust, swung his pick once more to break the stony ground. As he toiled all alone in desert isolation, no other sound was heard save his croaky voice as he daily would assert, "I'll be making me a fortune soon's I hit pay dirt." Paddy had been a prospecting for 50 years or more. From mountaintop to valley floor, the seductive lure of gold and silver ore had seen him trek from Kalgoorlie to Henty, dreaming of wealth and riches aplenty. Heeding not his aching back and feet with blisters girt, for I'll be making me a fortune soon's I hit pay dirt. Many were the times he thought his luck was in, a promising reef of quartz that proved to be too thin, or a lead of gravel wash that had no gold, just tin. Sure, there was the occasional nugget and patchy little show that yielded up some ounces and kept him on the go, but with real success, Paddy just never seemed to flirt. Still, I'll be making me a fortune soon as I hit pay dirt. The other diggers joked and laughed behind his back. Fool's gold, they'd say, their mind's a single track, is all he'll ever find, he'll riches always lack. Maybe they're right, said Paddy, as year gave way to year and failure followed failure and he heard their scornful sneer. But still he persevered, despite his critics' curt, because I'll be making me a fortune soon's I hit pay dirt. But Paddy never made the hit he'd always sought. His trusty pick grew rusty, just like my mind, he thought, and all his toil in barren soil sadly came to naught. When finally his eyes grew dim and he prepared to die, "I've lived a good and healthy life," he said, and surely that's no lie. "I've ne'er spoke ill of anyone or any creature hurt, so maybe that's my fortune, another kind of pay dirt." But when they came to bury Paddy and say a last goodbye, to lay him down with pious words, but hearts all powdered dry, they were neither keen enough of eye nor sharp enough of wit to notice just exposed in the bottom of the pit a reef of quartz, all white and bold, with the bright clear glint and sparkle of true metallic gold. Today, they say, if you come and stand beside that grave and strain your ears and bend your back and, well, be a little brave, you will hear a gentle tapping within the hallowed cave, a hammering and scraping and other digging sounds. And above the ghostly clatter, in words at last profound, if you listen very carefully and are especially alert, you'll hear, "I'm making me a fortune, now I've hit pay dirt." And with that, I want to say thank you.
Garry, would you like to take some questions?
Sure.
We'll just open up for questions now.
What are fumaroles? The word appeared on one of your slides.
A fumarole is an Italian origin word, and it refers to smoking, boiling, steaming springs in geothermal areas like Rotorua. A fumarole is where fumes or gas escapes from the ground. It's usually hot, it's usually smelly, rotten egg gas.
Thank you.
More questions? We go.
I have a question about theology, because hereafter you started at the University of Sydney, I started there, and I had an experience which caused me to divert from geology to botany. It was this. One of my fellow students discovered that all the best texts in geology, in the old Stacks and Fisher Library, had been moved down to theology by one of the more senior students.
No, I don't think I was quite that innovative in those days. But an interesting observation for sure. At the back.
Listening to you then, would you say that there's no such thing as climate change?
I didn't really come to talk about climate change, but all I would like to say is that climate change is a very real phenomenon that our Earth has been experienced for as long as it's been around. And it will continue to be so no matter what we do. I think there is no doubt that what humans are doing in the Earth at present is contributing to the change of the climate. The principal question that I would like to see answered and haven't seen satisfactorily answered is how much of the change we are currently seeing is due to us and how much is what would happen anyway. Because we have to recognize there are many factors besides burning of fossil fuels that put carbon dioxide in the air. And there are many other things that influence the climate besides the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. For a start, one of the, we usually see that the temperatures are quoted back to the sort of late 19th century. What that doesn't really recognize is that from about 1350 to 1850, temperatures were abnormally low during what is called the Little Ice Age, which is the time when Bruegel painted all those pictures of people skating on canals in Holland, and the Thames used to freeze over regularly and things like that. So much of the temperature rise since about 1850, which coincides with the development of industry, is also simply rebound from an unusually cold period. So there are many factors come into play, but the only one we can really influence is the amount of CO2 we generate. So I think that's the place to start.
We hear a lot these days about how sophisticated relatively Aboriginals were with astronomy, for example. I just wondered, in terms of geology, the Indigenous people, I know they've got legends and myths, but is there any sort of understanding of what we call geology now?
My own knowledge there is pretty limited. From what I have seen, read, or directly observed, the Indigenous people here in this continent were very quick and very happy to use soft, natural products, clays and ochres and things like that, and they used them very extensively and successfully in art and self-decoration and things like that. And of course, they used stones very extensively as being essentially a Stone Age people. I don't know of any record of them significantly using metal, and particularly because the occurrence of native metals is pretty rare. And if they ever noticed a gold nugget or two in the stream, they might have observed it, but not really found any real value in it. So they were certainly knowledgeable about which stones were effective in using for whether it be spear points or grinding stones or whatever. And some of these were actually traded across the country from one place to another and used extensively in that regard. But so it was more a direct use of rocks or stones for implements and of the weathered products of rocks and stones for decoration rather than anything more beyond that, I think.
Just going back to the climate change, I remember reading an article saying that the Earth will, Mother Nature will get through this. The key questions with the humans, or to us, the key questions. I have no doubt Earth will get through it, but we may not.
Well, I think that is the essence. When people say that they're going to save the planet, what they really mean is I'm trying to save my lifestyle.
Yeah.
Because the planet will do absolutely fine as it's done for 4,600 million years. It's not going to disappear all of a sudden. It's around for at least another 4 or 5 billion years to come. But yes, when we talk about saving the planet, what we're really saying is I want to try and save my lifestyle. Which of course means consumption of many materials that have an impact on the environment, no matter whatever you do, whether you generate energy with coal or whether you generate it with the sun, you need raw materials. And they, of course, obtaining and processing those raw materials has an impact on the environment. An electric car needs 4 times as much copper as an ordinary petrol car, for example. And yes, I do have a few copies of the book here if you're interested, what you're thinking.
Thank you very, very much, Garry. When people decide what university course they might do and sort of look at arts and sciences, and generally they equate the sciences with hard mathematical type of experience, and the arts with essay writing and poetry. Well, I think we've seen both with Garry's talk. The poetry of his language will be very, very much appreciated in the book, in the extracts that he's read to us, and very much appreciated in his method of delivery as well, not just the raw scientists. But it was absolutely fascinating to hear of all of those experiences. And if Garry speaks to school children and even to community members who might be looking for other experiences, what an inspiring speaker he is. But so thank you very, very much, Garry.
Thank you, Heather.